The terminal at Harrington International had a particular kind of quiet that existed nowhere else, the quiet of money moving fast. No one ran, no one raised their voice. Luggage glided on silent wheels. Conversations happened in low, controlled registers, as though even speech were a resource to be optimized. Amelia Hart moved through it like a current. She was 41 years old, 5'7" in flats, and had not worn flats in 11 years. Her coat was charcoal wool, cut precisely at mid-thigh. Her carry-on was graphite gray leather, monogrammed in a font so restrained it barely existed. She walked 3 feet ahead of her personal assistant, which was not rudeness, it was efficiency. The gap told the room everything. She was the decision, everyone else was execution. "The Geneva call has been moved to 7 a.m. local," said her assistant, Daniel Marsh, 28, perpetually 6 steps behind her both literally and figuratively. He held his tablet like a shield. "The bilateral with the Infrastructure Committee is still confirmed for Thursday." And Dr. Patel's office called again. "Tell them I'll call back." "That's what I told them last week." "Then tell them I'll call back again." She didn't break stride. The VIP lounge at Terminal C was accessible through a door that required a code and a card, and, on certain days, a brief conversation with a man named Patrick, who had been stationed there for 12 years, and who greeted Amelia by name every time as though he were proud of the association. She liked Patrick. He never needed anything from her. Inside, the lounge was the particular shade of beige that cost a great deal to achieve, not quite cream, not quite gray. A color that felt like being neither here nor there. The seating was deep, the lighting deliberately amber. Through floor-to-ceiling glass, the tarmac stretched toward a pewter-colored sky. Amelia chose a seat at the far corner, back to the wall, sightlines clear in both directions. She had done this in every room for 20 years. Not paranoia. Habit. The habit of someone who had learned early that corners were safe and centers were exposed. She opened her laptop. Her eyes moved across 3 browser tabs simultaneously. A quarterly projection spreadsheet, a due diligence memo on a company she was considering acquiring, and the transcript of a board meeting she had not personally attended. She read the way she did everything quickly, extracting signal from noise, leaving the rest. Across the lounge, in the opposite corner, the other corner, the symmetrical choice, sat a man she did not immediately notice. He was perhaps 37, 38. Dark hair, not styled. A flannel shirt, navy and gray check, untucked. Jeans. He had the look of someone who spent time outdoors but not for recreation, functional outdoor exposure, the kind that came from fixing things. His hands were resting on his knees, and he was looking at nothing in particular, with the expression of a man who was entirely comfortable doing nothing in particular. Beside him, cross-legged on the wide seat, was a girl of perhaps 7 years old. She had a spiral-bound sketchbook open across her lap and was drawing something with complete concentration. Pencil lines, careful and slow. Occasionally, she would hold the book out at arm's length, evaluate it, then return to work. The man, Caleb Mercer, though Amelia did not yet know this, was not on his phone. He was not reading. He was simply present in a way that most people in the lounge were not. Even though most people in the lounge were paying for the privilege of being present there. He had noticed, in the first 2 minutes of sitting down, the location of the automated external defibrillator mounted near the service counter. He had noted the position of the emergency exit. He had registered the subtle discoloration of the carpet near the east wall that suggested a plumbing repair done recently and inadequately. He did not think consciously about any of these things. He simply filed them. His daughter, Sophia, looked up from her sketchbook. "Dad, does a triangle have more corners or more sides?" He considered this with the seriousness it deserved. "Same number." She frowned. "That can't be right. 3 corners, 3 sides, equilateral." She counted silently, touching the drawing. "Oh." She went back to work. "I thought corners were different from sides." "They're related," he said. "You can't have one without the other." She absorbed this, added another line to her drawing. At the other end of the lounge, Amelia Hart pressed 2 fingers to her right temple and held them there for a moment. It was a gesture she had made perhaps 4 times in the past week. Not the gesture of a headache, she didn't get headaches, or refused to, but the gesture of pressure seeking release, of a body pushing back against the pace it was being driven at. She lowered her hand before Daniel could notice. He was already anxious. She did not need his anxiety layered over hers. She had been awake since 4:30 a.m. She had been awake at 4:30 a.m. every day for the past 3 weeks. The Hargrove acquisition had consumed the hours that used to be reserved for sleep, for food, for the 40-minute runs she had taken each morning as a form of non-negotiable maintenance. The runs had stopped first. Then breakfast. Then the sleep had degraded from 6 hours to 4, to whatever the body would accept, before forcing the issue. Dr. Priya Patel, her physician, had left 3 messages this month. The messages said, in various ways, your last blood work was not what we hoped for. Your blood pressure is elevated in a way I'd like to discuss. I know you're busy, but I need you to come in. Amelia had not gone in. She took a sip of black coffee, her third since 6 a.m., and returned to the acquisition memo. Outside the floor-to-ceiling glass, the sky pressed down on the tarmac in the particular way it did before weather arrived. Amelia did not look at the sky. She had not looked at a sky in some time. The boarding announcement came over the intercom at 8:47 a.m. Geneva, via Zurich. Boarding was in 30 minutes. Amelia set down her coffee cup. She noticed, distantly, that her vision had a slight shimmer at the edges, the kind that came before a migraine. She had had 2 migraines in the past month, both managed with medication that her assistant kept in a dedicated pouch in her bag. She reached for the bag. Her hand didn't quite coordinate with the reaching. She paused, looked at her hand, opened and closed it. Fine. Everything fine. She opened the acquisition memo again. The shimmer intensified at 8:52 a.m. Amelia stood to ask Daniel something she would never remember what, and the room tilted. Not dramatically. Subtly, the way a ship tilts when you can't see the water moving but your inner ear registers it. She put a hand on the back of her chair. The hand was clammy. Daniel was looking at his tablet. He hadn't noticed. Around the lounge, the other passengers were absorbed in laptops, in phones, in the particular tunnel of their own concerns. The woman near the window was reading printed documents and highlighting with a yellow marker. 2 men in matching blue ties were talking quietly about something contentious based on the angle of their bodies. The barista behind the service counter was restocking the pastry case. No one was looking at Amelia Hart. She took 3 steps toward the service counter with the idea of getting water. On the second step, her vision went monochromatic, a brief, total whitening, like an overexposed photograph. She reached for the nearest chair and caught air instead. She went down without a sound. No cry, no warning, no dramatic stumble. Simply there, and then not there, and then on the floor, which was carpeted and thick enough to absorb the fall without violence. She was on her side, one hand still partially extended in the direction of the chair she hadn't caught. Her face was the color of paper. Her breathing was there, shallow, irregular, present but wrong, in a way that did not announce itself loudly. For approximately 4 seconds, the room processed this slowly. Daniel looked up from his tablet. He did not immediately understand what he was seeing. The woman by the window put down her highlighter. A man near the door made an ambiguous movement forward, then back, then still. One of the 2 men in blue ties said, "Oh my God," in a tone that was informational rather than helpful. The security guard stationed near the lounge entrance was named Ryan Kowalski. He had been at this post for 6 months. His training was thorough, and the training told him clearly what to do in a medical emergency. And yet, in this specific moment, in this specific lounge, with this specific woman who was on every piece of masthead in every business publication in the building, the training competed with something slower and heavier. The weight of consequence, the fear of error, the particular paralysis that comes from acting on someone powerful. He reached for his radio. He had not yet moved toward her. Caleb Mercer was already moving. He was on his feet before the 4-second pause ended, before any conscious decision had been registered. The body does this. When trained correctly, the gap between perception and action collapses. He crossed the lounge in 8 steps, economical and fast, and was on one knee beside her before anyone else had decided to stand. He looked at her face first, then her neck, then the rise and fall of her chest. He said, with the clarity of someone who had run controlled rooms before, "Call for emergency medical. Tell them possible cardiac or neurological event. Female, approximately 40. Down in the VIP lounge at Terminal C." Now, not loud at all. But the room reorganized itself around the instruction. Daniel fumbled for his phone. Ryan Kowalski stopped reaching for his radio and actually used it. Caleb's fingers found the pulse point at Amelia's neck. He timed it. He tilted her head with 2 fingers, gently, checking her airway. His hands moved without hesitation, not because he was unfeeling, but because hesitation is what kills people in these moments. And he knew this in a way that had cost him something to learn. "Give her space," he said to the room at large. "Back up. She needs air, and she needs floor. Move the chairs." The man in the blue tie moved a chair. Sophia had not moved from her seat. She sat with her sketchbook on her lap, watching her father work. Her face was calm not because she didn't understand, but because she had seen her father competent in difficult moments, and had learned to take that competence as a form of safety. Caleb checked Amelia's pupils with a small penlight he kept in his jacket pocket. A habit, not an affectation. He pressed 2 fingers along her jaw, checking reflexes. He assessed the color of her lips, the texture of her skin, the way her breathing was trending. "She's not in arrest," he said, mostly to himself. Then, louder, "Does anyone here know her? Any medical history?" Daniel said, from 6 feet away, voice cracking. She's been under a lot of stress. She had some blood work. She was supposed to see her doctor. Medication? She has migraine medication in her bag. And I think there's something for blood pressure. She started it 2 months ago." Caleb absorbed this without reacting to it. He found the bag, didn't open it. Set it where the paramedics would find it immediately. He watched Amelia's face. Her color was still wrong, but her breathing was steadying. He placed 2 fingers on her wrist. Spoke quietly, almost to her, though he was not certain she could hear. "You're not alone. There are people here. Just breathe." Whether she heard it or not, her breathing settled into something more regular. At the lounge entrance, 2 paramedics arrived with a cart. Caleb stood, stepped back, gave them his assessment in 30 seconds. Estimated syncopal episode. Possible hypertensive crisis precipitating. No observed seizure activity. Pulse present throughout. Airway clear. Patient's assistant has medication list. He gave them the bag. One of the paramedics, a young woman with very short hair and a focused expression, glanced at him and said, "You a physician?" "I'm not," he said. "I used to work in emergency medical response systems." She nodded, processed this, moved on. Caleb stepped all the way back to the perimeter of the room. Sophia had put her sketchbook down and was watching him. He went to her and sat beside her. "Is she going to be okay?" Sophia asked. "They're going to take very good care of her," he said. "That's not what I asked." He looked at her, this child who had inherited, from somewhere, an intolerance for evasion. "I think so," he said. She got help in time. Sophia considered this and picked up her sketchbook again. She had drawn, during all of this, a triangle, 3 corners, 3 sides. The paramedics worked for 9 minutes inside the lounge before transferring Amelia to the gurney. During those 9 minutes, Caleb sat with Sophia and did not look at Amelia, because looking at her was not his role anymore. He had completed his role. He had handed it off, cleanly, to the people who held it next. This was a discipline, not a natural one. Daniel was on the phone with someone, the board, maybe, or legal, or someone at the top of Amelia's organization whose job was to be called in moments like this. His voice was low and tight. The other passengers had relocated to the far side of the lounge, with the particular discretion of people who are both shaken and unwilling to show it. A man in a gray suit approached Caleb. late 40s, the bearing of someone who managed other people's security. He said, "The woman who collapsed, she's CEO of Harrington Group. I'm Marcus Webb, head of her security detail. I need to take your information." Caleb looked at him. "She's in good hands now." "I understand that, sir. For our records, the paramedics have everything that's medically relevant. They'll share it with the hospital." He stood. "We're going to miss our flight." Marcus Webb watched him walk away. Then he watched him stop at the gate desk, where the boarding call was just beginning, and show his boarding pass. The flight was Caleb's flight. To Portland, not Geneva. He had been in the same lounge by coincidence, or by whatever word applies when two strangers occupy a room that turns out to matter. Marcus Webb wrote down the name from the gate agent's scanner log. Caleb Mercer. Portland, via Gate C-14. Amelia Hart opened her eyes in an emergency bay at Harrington Memorial Hospital at approximately 11 a.m., and the first thing she saw was ceiling tiles. She had seen these tiles before at the hospital's grand opening, which she had funded 8 years ago. She had stood in this building and given a speech about accessibility and infrastructure and the obligation of capital to community. The tiles had been new then. They were slightly yellowed now. She had not noticed until this moment. Dr. Patel was at the bedside. Her face held no accusation. Because she had practiced holding no accusation, it held only the practiced calm of a physician who has watched patients disregard their health until their health disregarded them back. "You're stable," she said. "You had a hypertensive crisis. Your systolic was 212 when the paramedics brought you in." Amelia said nothing for a moment. "The Geneva meeting has been cancelled," said Dr. Patel. "Daniel has been informed." Another moment. "For how long?" "You'll be here overnight for observation. After that, we need to have a serious conversation about your schedule and your medications, both of which you have been managing poorly." She paused. "I've been trying to reach you for 3 weeks, Amelia." "I know." "Then you understand that this is what that conversation was designed to prevent." Amelia closed her eyes. Not from tiredness, from something else. A reckoning of the kind that is difficult to conduct with witnesses. She let herself have 4 seconds of it, then opened them again. "There was a man," she said, "in the lounge. He helped me before the paramedics arrived. Your assistant told me." "We don't have his name." "Finham." Dr. Patel tilted her head slightly. "Whoever he is," Amelia said, "find him." Marcus Webb was thorough. It was the quality that had kept him employed in his industry for 22 years. And it was the quality he applied within 4 hours to the problem of identifying the man from the VIP lounge. Caleb Mercer. 41. Portland, Oregon. Originally, though he had relocated to this city 3 years ago. Single father, his daughter, Sophia, was 7. He worked as an independent consultant in emergency preparedness, which meant, in practice, that he reviewed safety protocols for mid-sized organizations, advised on response planning, and occasionally trained staff. He billed modestly, worked selectively, and had a small but apparently genuine professional reputation. Before Portland, he had spent 9 years as a research director at a firm called Meridian Response Systems, a company that developed integrated medical emergency frameworks for corporate and public institutional environments. His name appeared on 4 academic papers and 2 patents, none of which were held by him personally. They had been assigned to Meridian at the time of their development. He had left Meridian 3 years ago, abruptly, under circumstances that Marcus Webb could not determine from the information available. There was a gap in his public record, approximately 18 months in duration, between his departure from Meridian and the establishment of his current consultancy. Marcus Webb noted the gap and moved on. Because gaps were not necessarily relevant, and Marcus Webb was thorough but not intrusive. He brought the file to Amelia at 3 p.m., while she was sitting up in her hospital bed with a laptop that Dr. Patel had not approved of, but also had not removed. Amelia read the file. Then she set the laptop aside and said, "Pull the rejected proposals from 18 months ago. Everything that came through the innovation intake. Everything that went to Bradley's team. Bradley Harmon was Amelia's chief operating officer, a position he had held for 6 years. He was competent, precise, and territorial in the manner of people who have held a position long enough that they have begun to confuse the position with their identity. Marcus Webb said, "What am I looking for?" "A proposal from Caleb Mercer," she said. "Something related to medical emergency response systems." She paused. "And find out who rejected it." The proposal arrived in Amelia's inbox at 5:47 p.m., flagged by Marcus Webb with a single line of context. Found in the archived intake queue. Marked "Does not meet current strategic priorities." Rejected by Director Harmon. Never escalated. She read it that evening, in the hospital bed, with the IV drip still in her arm, and Dr. Patel's voice from the morning circling in her head. The proposal was 42 pages long, and had been submitted 18 months ago, roughly 6 weeks before Caleb Mercer appeared on any record she had been able to find in her own city. It was titled, "Integrated Emergency Medical Response, a Scalable Framework for Corporate Campus and Transportation Hub Environments." It was meticulous. She knew technical proposals, had read hundreds of them, had signed off on half a dozen significant ones, had seen enough mediocre ones to recognize quality. This was quality. The framework it described was elegant in the specific way that good engineering solutions are elegant. It solved a real problem without creating 3 new ones. It accounted for variables that obvious solutions would overlook, and it was written by someone who understood both the mechanics of medical emergency response and the institutional environments in which emergencies actually occurred. She thought of herself on the floor of the VIP lounge at Terminal C. She thought of the AED that Caleb had clearly already located before she fell. She thought of the 4 seconds during which no one moved, and what those 4 seconds might have cost her. She turned to the section of the proposal titled, "The Problem of Delayed Response in High-Density, Low-Preparation Environments." She read it twice. The proposal described, with documentation and case studies, the specific conditions under which capable people fail to respond effectively to medical emergencies in institutional settings, the paralysis of unfamiliar protocol, the diffusion of responsibility in crowds, the absence of prepared responders in environments that assume someone else will handle it. It proposed a layered solution. Training programs. Environmental modifications, such as the placement of emergency equipment in visible, accessible locations, rather than tucked behind service counters, and a real-time coordination system that could be deployed across a company's owned and operated physical environments. It also proposed, in a single line in the executive summary, that the technology could save between 12 and 40 lives per year in a corporation of Harrington Group's size and physical footprint. Bradley Harmon had marked it "Does not meet current strategic priorities." He had not shown it to Amelia. She set the laptop on the bedside table. Outside the window, the city was darkening into its evening configuration, lights coming on in a specific sequence. High floors first, the geometry of commerce winding down. She thought about the 18 months between Caleb Mercer leaving Meridian Response Systems and the current day. She thought about the gap in his record. She had not asked Marcus Webb to investigate it, because it was not directly relevant. But she found herself wanting to know. She called Daniel. "I need background on Meridian Response Systems," she said. "Specifically, whatever happened there approximately 3 years ago. And I need the personnel file on Bradley Harmon, specifically every major intake decision he made in the last 2 years, and which proposals from the innovation queue he escalated versus rejected." Daniel did not ask why. It was part of what made him good at his job. "And Daniel," she said, "send flowers to his daughter, the man from the lounge. To Sophia Mercer. White daisies, something appropriate for a child. Card should say, 'Thank you for waiting patiently today.'" Caleb Mercer's apartment was on the 4th floor of a building on Birchwood Avenue, a street with 2 coffee shops and a hardware store, and large trees that had been there longer than anything else on the block. The apartment was not a particularly impressive space. It was clean, organized in the specific way of a person who has made peace with having less, not sparse from poverty but sparse from preference, from having decided that objects require maintenance and maintenance requires time, And time was the one thing he did not have in excess. The living room contained a couch, a coffee table with 3 books on it, and a wall of photographs, mostly of Sophia, a few of landscapes, one of a woman with Sophia's eyes, and a laugh caught mid-expression, frozen in the particular way that photographs freeze what they are trying to preserve. Caleb rarely looked directly at this photograph. He was aware of it in the way of things that are always present and never needed to be examined. Amelia came on a Thursday afternoon, unannounced. Because she suspected that announced visits gave people the opportunity to prepare defenses, and defenses were what she was trying to see past. She brought nothing except her car and a specific posture, not CEO, not client, not supplicant. She had not decided what she was bringing, so she brought the absence of all of those things and hoped it was enough. He answered the door in the flannel shirt, a different one, similar pattern, and held it open before she could speak, which meant he had known she was coming somehow, or that he was simply the kind of person who did not require a preamble. "I'm Amelia Hart," she said. "I know," he said. "Come in." The apartment was as it had been. Clean, precise. Inhabited by someone who had made peace with their inventory. Sophia was at the kitchen table with a large piece of paper and what appeared to be an ambitious architectural drawing of a treehouse. She looked up, assessed Amelia with the directness of a 7-year-old unaware that directness required modulation, and returned to her drawing. "Nice coat," Sophia said to the drawing. "Thank you," said Amelia. Caleb made 2 cups of tea without being asked. This was, Amelia would think later, the most disorienting thing about him. He was not nervous in her presence. Most people were nervous in her presence. It was not something she cultivated deliberately, but it was something she had grown accustomed to, the slight elevation in the room's tension that occurred when she entered it. Caleb experienced no such elevation, or if he did, it did not surface. He made the tea, set the mugs on the table, sat across from her. "You read the proposal," he said. "I did." "Then you know what you want to say. I want to understand what happened. Not the proposal, exactly. What happened at Meridian?" He looked at her for a moment. Not guardedly. He had sat down guarded somewhere along the way. He looked at her the way he had looked at the AED and the emergency exits, cataloging, assessing, deciding what information was necessary. "My wife was on a corporate campus," he said. "A client of ours, actually. She had a cardiac event in a conference room. There were 40 people in the building, and none of them knew what to do. They called 911. They waited. They stood in the hallway. The AED was in a supply closet behind a locked door that required a key held by facilities management, who was at lunch." He paused. "She waited 11 minutes for intervention. The paramedics arrived at 14 minutes. It was too long." Amelia said nothing. There was nothing useful to say to this, and she had learned, though the learning had been difficult, that silence in the presence of a real thing was more honest than filling the space. "So I built the framework," he said. "Everything in that proposal. I spent 2 years building it at Meridian, and then it became clear that Meridian was more interested in selling adjacent products than implementing the solution. And there was a board argument, and I left. I took the concept, but not the patents, and I spent a year being a person who wasn't building anything. And then I started pitching. And Bradley Harmon rejected you. Someone did. I didn't know who." He wrapped both hands around his mug. "I sent the proposal to maybe 30 companies. I got a standard rejection from Harrington Group, which said nothing except that it didn't meet current priorities. I got similar responses from 8 others. 2 companies passed the proposal on to their legal teams, which was enough to tell me they were interested in something other than implementation." He looked at her. "I stopped pitching." "Why?" "Because I have a 7-year-old, he said, simply. "And because I decided that if the people who could deploy this didn't want it, they would figure out eventually what that meant. As they did." He said this without bitterness. It was not a point scored. It was a description of cause and effect. "How are you feeling?" The abrupt shift caught her. "Better. Medicated correctly. For the first time in months, apparently." "Good. Dr. Patel wants me to consider what she calls substantive changes to my work pattern. which is her way of saying she wants me to work fewer than 80 hours a week. The corner of his mouth moved. Revolutionary proposal. I found it radical. She set down her mug. I want to make this right. The proposal. I want to implement it. And I want to understand if that's something you're willing to do. He was quiet for a moment. On the other side of the kitchen, Sophia was drawing a spiral staircase inside the treehouse. Under what conditions? He said. Yours, she said. Within reason. Then I have two. The first is that it doesn't encroach on what I do outside of work hours, which includes this building and that child. The second is that it doesn't become something else. It doesn't become a story about me. It doesn't become something that gets attached to a press release or used as evidence that the company is community-minded or whatever the word is this year. It's an implementation project. It solves a problem. That's all it is. Amelia thought about this. She thought about how accustomed she was to every decision having a secondary valence, the thing itself. And then the story about the thing. And then the story about the story. She thought about what it would mean to do something that was only what it was. Agreed, she said. He nodded once, picked up his mug. Tuesday, he said. I can come in Tuesday. Bradley Harmon had been with Harrington Group for 6 years. His tenure was not defined by egregious failure, no single catastrophic decision, no scandal, no departure from the general professional norms of a corporation of Harrington Group's size and profile. His tenure was defined instead by the accumulation of small choices, each individually defensible, that in aggregate described a preference for protecting existing revenue streams over developing new ones, for maintaining relationships with vendors who had already proven themselves profitable over entertaining the uncertain propositions of outsiders. Caleb's proposal had not been the only casualty. Marcus Webb's audit of Bradley's intake decisions from the past 2 years identified 11 proposals that had been rejected without escalation. 11 cases where Bradley had been the last filter rather than one of several. Of these 11, 4 were directly related to safety systems or operational response infrastructure. 2 had since been implemented by competitors, with measurable results. Amelia spent 4 days with these files before she presented them to her board. She did not do this because she was angry. She had, by the time she sat across from her attorneys and began preparing the presentation, moved through anger and arrived somewhere quieter and colder, a place that her board members would recognize as deliberate because she was always deliberate. What she was, in this specific moment, was clear. She was clear about what had been lost. Not only her, on the floor of Terminal C, though that was real and personal, and she was still working out what to do with it. She was clear about the others. The people in 12 facilities who had worked in buildings with inadequate emergency protocols for the past 2 years because Bradley Harmon had decided that a consultant's proposal didn't meet current strategic priorities. The people who had been in rooms where something went wrong, and the nearest trained responder was 4 hallways away. She was also clear about her own culpability. She had built a system that made it possible for Bradley Harmon to be the last filter without oversight. She had run a company at a speed that made detailed review of intake decisions a structural impossibility. She had been the CEO of a corporation whose own buildings were demonstrably less safe than they could have been, and she had not known this, because knowing things like this required a kind of operational attention she had been too busy to pay. Both things were true. She had been failed. She had also failed. The board meeting was scheduled for a Wednesday afternoon. She had asked Caleb to attend, and he had agreed, with the quiet reservation that he would present the technical materials and leave the governance portion of the meeting to the people who governed. He arrived at the Harrington Group headquarters in the same flannel shirt, or another one exactly like it. She could no longer tell, and a blazer over it that was clean and pressed, a concession to the environment that was also a refusal to abandon himself to it. He carried a folder and a USB drive and made no small talk with anyone in the lobby. Amelia met him at the elevator. "You ready?" she said. "Are you?" he said. The Harrington Group board met in a room on the 31st floor that had been designed to convey stability and permanence. The table was a single piece of dark wood, 15 feet long. The chairs were the kind that communicated authority not through ornament, but through weight. The view through the windows was the city at its most comprehensible, ordered. Clear. The grid laid out below, like a problem that had already been solved. 11 board members, 2 lawyers, 1 general counsel, 1 chief financial officer, Bradley Harmon at the far end, in the chair that was his by proximity and precedent, with the expression of a man who suspected that the meeting had a shape he did not know yet. Amelia stood at the head of the table. She did not use notes. 11 days ago, she said, I collapsed in a VIP lounge at Terminal C of Harrington International. Most of you have received the summary from Dr. Patel, so I won't spend time on the medical details. She paused. What I want to spend time on is what happened in the 4 seconds before anyone in that room moved toward me. She described it precisely. The lounge, the trained security personnel, the experienced staff, the bystanders who were educated and capable, and, in the moment, immobilized. She described Caleb Mercer crossing the room before anyone else had decided to stand. She described the AED mounted near the service counter, which he had located within 2 minutes of entering the space. She described the proposal sitting in an archived intake queue for 18 months. I'm going to ask that the proposal be formally reintroduced and reviewed by this board, she said. Alongside it, I'm presenting an audit of intake decisions made unilaterally over the past 2 years. She nodded to Marcus Webb, who placed a printed copy at each board member's place. You'll note that 11 proposals were rejected without escalation. 4 of these were directly relevant to safety and operational response. I want to understand how our intake process allows for that kind of single point of failure, and I want to propose structural changes to ensure it doesn't continue. There was silence in the room. Not the silence of shock. These were people who handled difficult information regularly. It was the silence of evaluation. Bradley Harmon said, These proposals go through a rigorous filtering process. It's not possible to escalate every submission. No, Amelia said. It isn't. Which is why I'd like to talk about what criteria are being applied to make those decisions, and whether those criteria have been made explicit and reviewed. She met his eyes. Bradley, I think you made reasonable decisions according to a set of priorities that hadn't been clearly examined in some time. I also think this process needs more structure. That's a conversation we need to have. It was not a vindication. It was not quite an accusation. It was a description, precise and honest, of a system that had produced a specific outcome and could be redesigned to produce different ones. Caleb stood when Amelia gestured to him. He opened the folder. He did not smile or make the kind of preliminary remarks that people make when they are trying to establish likability before substance. He simply began presenting the framework. He presented it in 12 minutes. He used 3 slides, not because that was all he had, but because that was what was necessary. The board members leaned forward slightly. The way people do when they are tracking something real. He answered 4 questions from the CFO about cost structure. 1 from a board member about liability implications, and 1 from the general counsel about implementation timelines, all with the precision of someone who had thought through these objections many times in the preceding years. When he was done, he sat down and did not add anything else. The board voted at 4:14 p.m. on a Wednesday afternoon to approve Phase 1 of the implementation. They also approved a formal structural review of intake and escalation protocols. Bradley Harmon submitted his resignation 2 days later, by email, in a letter that thanked the company for the opportunity and cited a desire to pursue other interests. Amelia read the resignation letter once and filed it. Implementation took 8 months. It was not dramatic. There were no press releases. Amelia honored that condition with the precision she applied to everything. There were meetings, proposals, vendor assessments, training schedules, site surveys. Caleb came in on Tuesdays and Thursdays, left at 4 p.m., did not attend anything that required a weekend, and declined to be photographed in the materials that were developed for internal staff communications. The framework was deployed across 14 of Harrington Group's owned facilities. Staff were trained not performatively, but actually, in the specific and practiced way that training has to happen to produce behavioral change. Emergency equipment was relocated to visible, accessible positions. Response protocols were embedded into onboarding materials and refreshed quarterly. A real-time coordination system went live in April, running quietly in the background of things, present without announcing itself. 3 events in the 8-month period activated the new protocols: a cardiac event at a conference center, a severe allergic reaction in a corporate cafeteria, and a diabetic emergency in a parking structure. In each case, the response time was measured in seconds rather than minutes. In each case, the people involved were alive. Amelia knew about all 3. She did not publicize any of them. She noted them the way she noted things that mattered, carefully and with a kind of attention that was different from the attention she had paid to acquisition memos and quarterly projections. Slower, more present. She had, at Dr. Patel's recommendation, made substantive changes to her work pattern. Not dramatic ones. She had not become someone who ran on beaches at dawn or talked expansively about boundaries. She had simply reintroduced, deliberately, the hours that had been eroding the morning run, which she did not love but which returned something essential to her body. The meals that were not eaten while reading. The sleep that was 6 hours rather than 4. She was not, by anyone's assessment, a transformed person. She was the same person running at a more sustainable speed. She thought this was probably the right outcome. Transformation implied the old self had been entirely wrong, and she was not interested in that kind of narrative. She had been efficient and capable, and she had also neglected things. Both were true. The work was to hold both. Caleb had said something, on a Tuesday in March, when the implementation was in its 5th month, and she had stopped by his office. He had a small space with a door, which he kept closed, and 2 whiteboards covered in diagrams that were not decorative but functional, covered in actual working thought. He had said it without looking up from what he was writing. "You're going to get this one right, and the next one you'll notice earlier." She had not asked what he meant by the next one. She understood him, and understanding him did not require elaboration. The morning in May was clear in the specific way of early summer light that was not yet ruthless, that still had softness in it. Harrington International's Terminal C was in the middle of a renovation. One wall of the original structure was being replaced with full-height glass, and the lounge where Amelia had collapsed was temporarily operating from a relocated space 2 gates down. She was traveling to Geneva. The trip that had been canceled 8 months ago, rescheduled twice, finally confirmed. She had brought 1 bag instead of 2. Daniel walked beside her rather than 3 feet behind, which was a difference neither of them had discussed and both of them had noticed. She was at the gate 20 minutes before boarding, not the margin that required constant management of a 30-minute buffer, but an actual 20 minutes, enough to sit down, to be still, to be present in the space rather than in the screen. She saw them near the relocated lounge entrance. Sophia first, because Sophia was hard to miss. She was wearing a yellow jacket and carrying the sketchbook, open to a fresh page, already drawing. She was sitting cross-legged on a wide seat in a way that suggested the seat's intended use was irrelevant to her purposes. Caleb was standing slightly apart, looking at his phone, actually looking at his phone, which was unusual enough that she suspected it was something involving Sophia's school or logistics of the day. He wore a different flannel, navy this time. He had a backpack over one shoulder that said something about the fact that he and his daughter were flying somewhere. And the somewhere felt ordinary and complete. He looked up. They were perhaps 30 feet apart. She had, in the past 8 months, spoken to him in conference rooms and in hallways, and once on the phone at 8 p.m. when a question about the cardiac protocol required an answer that couldn't wait until Tuesday. She had not been to his apartment again. She had not seen Sophia since the Thursday afternoon with the tea and the treehouse drawing, though she had sent daisies at Christmas a second time, because the first time had seemed to matter, and the second time felt honest rather than obligatory. Caleb looked at her. Amelia looked at him. Sophia looked up from the sketchbook, assessed the situation with the directness that was apparently constitutionally innate, and then returned to her drawing. Whatever was happening between these 2 adults, it had been categorized as resolved, and did not require intervention. Caleb lifted his chin, a small movement, an acknowledgement, a thing that contained everything it contained without performing any of it. Amelia nodded back. It was not a conclusion. It was a description of something that had no easy name. Two people who had found, in a room where everything went wrong, the particular clarity that arrives when the ordinary scaffolding of social performance is stripped away by necessity. She had been on the floor, helpless. And he had been there not because she was important or connected, or because there was anything in it for him, but because he had moved toward the emergency when others had not. That was what she thought about, boarding the plane to Geneva. Not the framework, not the board vote, not the 3 lives that had been saved in 8 months by systems now running in buildings she owned. She thought about 4 seconds in which everyone in a room full of capable people had stood still, and one man had moved. Sophia Mercer, at 7 years old, with a yellow jacket and a sketchbook and the fierce concentration of someone building something true, looked up one more time as Amelia disappeared through the gate. She drew a circle. Then she drew a line from it, leading somewhere off the page. She wasn't sure yet where it went, but she drew it anyway.